Subcommittee. It's a little bit mistitled. I think searches should be in the title of the subcommittee because it's more about searches than it is about questioning. So we have a couple of guests at the table. Mr. Winston Burton, who's the Vice President of the NAACP, and Lieutenant Dan Montgomery from the Berkeley Police Department. Warrantless searches on parolees, and we can get into the details of that as we discuss perhaps, but anyway, it is, as was mentioned, as far as we know, the first of its kind in California. It is in line with many other states, but first in California, so we can get to the details of that as we proceed. I wanted to I don't know whether you all had a chance to read my revised statement here, but this is in line. I don't need to, go through the whole thing, but it's in line with my thinking on the subject. And one thing I did want to underscore is that I am convinced that the Berkeley police officers are not engaged in conscious racial profiling. Just want to put that on record. But it doesn't mean that they might not be subject to the same kind of implicit biases that pervade our culture and that affect the actions of so many of us. And in that regard, I'm going to call your attention to a study by the psychologist at Stanford, Jennifer Eberhardt, about which we've heard something already. She was interviewed by Time magazine, and I thought it would be good to start the conversation with one point from her interview. The interviewer says, "You open your new book called Biased." She has a new book out called Biased, Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shapes What We See, Think, and Do. You open your new book with the story of your son. She's African American. With your son worrying that a fellow black passenger will blow up a plane. Why? Asks the interviewer. She answers, to show how deep implicit bias is and how it can affect everyone, even a black child. this is something that everybody has to grapple with. We're living in a society where we're absorbing images and ideas all the time, and it takes over who we are and how we see the world. She goes on to talk about, she did a study of Oakland. 1 out of black people in Oakland were handcuffed when stopped, while only 1 out of 15 whites.
What was the first one?
1 out of 4. In 2013, 2014, and 1 out of 15 whites were done so. Police were seeing it as an officer safety issue, but it's traumatic and was having an impact on the community. So, you know, I think it's important to recognize that. And my purpose in proposing this committee and in my statement here, my proposal, is that we all are subject to implicit biases. It would be highly unusual if we weren't, based on psychological and neurological study. One thing we can do, though, is to enact policies that minimize the chances that these biases will materialize into practice or action. And that's the purpose of, that's behind my thinking here. It's not that police officers are racist or more biased than anyone else, but given the biases that pervade our culture and that I would argue are behind some of these statistics, we need policies that minimize the possibility or inhibit these biases from materializing into action. And so one thing we can do, it seems to me, is to enact restrictions on these searches and parole and probation questions. By the way, I also came across policy 401 in the police department services manual. The policy is fair and impartial policing. You don't have this because it just came across my desk, or I found it this morning. Policy 401.2. Investigative detentions, traffic stops, arrests, searches, and property seizures by officers will be based on a standard of reasonable suspicion or probable cause, not on race or ethnicity. It struck me as interesting that in the policy here, talking about stops and searches, it says nothing about special circumstances for parole and probation, but that they should always be based on a standard of reasonable suspicion or probable cause. I didn't find anything Lieutenant, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I didn't find anything in the manual or in the general orders or anything that says there's a special situation for these other kinds of searches. Do you know if it exists?
So yeah, I did the same searches of our policy because I was looking for where we would put,
Right.
if we came up with some poly language, where would it belong?
I looked at traffic stops and didn't find anything, but then I found this and I thought, it says specifically searches.
Right. So there's a couple things. I was involved in the drafting of this policy. I worked in professional standards when we were dealing with this policy, and we negotiated this policy with the Police Review Commission. We worked on it for a little over a year.
Right.
And I can tell you that sort of the not legislative, but the intent that we were working with when we developed that policy is we weren't tackling issues surrounding probation or parole or that kind of thing. When we drafted that language, we weren't speaking about that.
Right.
The other thing to consider is we do have a policy on search and seizure, and it talks about consent. And in terms of probation specifically, the way the courts view consent or view probation searches is that those are searches that have been consented to when a person agrees to go on probation in lieu of some other punishment.
Right. And I appreciate you sent around the discussion of different types of searches.
Right.
Yeah, that was informative. So, yeah, and so the judge, correct me if I'm wrong, but the judge, when they impose probation, they impose the conditions, one of which would be that you're eligible to be searched or consenting to be searched. The parole statute in California imposes this condition on parolees.
As a matter of, it's part of the sentence in the case of parole.
So I guess, what I would wanna say about this is, this doesn't mean that police officers are going to stop at will motorists or people on the street and ask them if they're on parole or probation. They use this just in a discretionary way. And by the same token, we can, as an oversight committee, we can limit that discretion. You know, my point is that even though it's in the statute that they are subject to this, police officers don't willy-nilly ask that question and impose that search. Elliot?
That's not true.
Can I give a little background on that? I'll support
No,
that
go
point.
ahead.
Right.
Go ahead.
So the ACLU and the NAACP worked very hard to draft the fair and impartial policing, and starting in 2015. And during that period, again, there was a reluctance of especially the African American community to come to the PRC with their complaints, because the word in the neighborhood was that it was very one-sided and would only be embarrassed. So they came to the NAACP, and when the drug task force was still a entity in the police department, that parole question was used as harassment, no question. And I think that was one of the things that may have led to the disbanding of that task force. But parents used to come to the NAACP, that their young men especially, walking along the street, where a car would drive up and say, "Are you on parole?" But also, especially young African American men, when they were older, when they were stopped, they were always asked the question, and if they did answer yes, they were searched without, any reasonable cause. So, the point is that I think it begs a policy on how to proceed. I agree with your statement that, it's not, especially since the task force was just disbanded. It's happening less, but it's still happening. And, it could be misinterpretation of law. I should ask this question, et cetera. But it begs a policy for officers to follow.
Oh, go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to respond to the profiling and disparity, because I see that word is here. And the data that was collected that shows how much often that African Americans are stopped, and that they were found out to be not have committed any type of crime. To me, and to a lot of us in the African American community and ACP, we do see this as profiling. That people are being profiled. Why else would those numbers reflect that? And one of the comments that I had talked to Andy about it, and he said that that the reason that more African Americans were stopped was because there's more of them that are committing crimes. There's a disparity in the number of crimes, but what this analysis said that African Americans were stopped and not presented with the fact that they had an type of crime. So why else would they be stopped if it's not profiling? Right. So I think that does exist, and that there is a disparity, and that's one of the things. I see that word here, but it wasn't in the report that was given to the Public Safety Committee, that there was never acknowledged that this disparity exists. And just on my own personal, I was stopped as a young man and by an African American officer, and me come you stop it all the time, you know? And he said, there's 3 things that we stop you for. They all begin with a W. It is that we stop you, we think that we'll find a weapon, a warrant, or weed on it. You know, I mean, this is African American.
Before weed was legal.
Oh, yeah, before, and they might have found that on us, you know, but it is a profiling that exists, and not just by white officers that are doing that, and this is in Philadelphia, and it just came out that there was 72 officers that were pulled off of the streets in Philadelphia because of the comments that they were making, disparaging African Americans, Hispanics, in the community. So there is something going on that is being addressed, and you know, so I think that there is a profiling that's happening, and it's
You know,
endemic.
right. Terry, did you?
I'd just like to go through a few questions that I have.
Sure.
I mean, it's like, try to get to the point, because I have to leave at 12:30.
We'll
So,
be finished.
okay, well, okay, we'll see.
We'll have to leave.
But, here's my thinking on it. I was just reading this Oakland piece, and we saw the one from last week.
Right.
It was this is a little more detailed about, and they actually approved it. And so, I just wanted to go through a few things here. You know, we don't have the actual text.
I believe it's what we saw last week, which I thought was more detailed.
But
This thing,
There's another article here from,
Yeah,
the Mercury.
but
I
this
don't
was pretty
think
detailed.
that actually had, we don't know that that's the text they approved.
No, we don't know for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm just going off of this thing
Yeah.
that we just got today.
Mm-hmm.
And they're talking about, I'm looking at page 2 there, 1, 2, third paragraph, on the one we got today.
Mm-hmm.
Says, under the new policy, warrantless searches on parolees and probationary.
Wait, that's not that's the third, which, it's not
It's
the
not
third
page
paragraph.
two.
I'm on the Oakland,
Oh, on page 2?
Page 3.
Page
That's
2.
page 3.
Page 3.
That would be page 3, look at the top.
Oh, I'm
Yeah,
sorry, yeah.
page
I
three.
thought it was, I didn't know there was a back on the other one. I'm sorry, page 3. Says under the, paragraph 3, under the new policy, warrantless searches on parolees and probationaries must only be done when there is a, quote, legitimate law enforcement purpose. I'm, looking for what that means in the actual policy. And then the next paragraph is much like we read last week, right? It said police will not be allowed to immediately ask about a person's parole or probation status. And as I remember the language last week, we'll have to look it up, they could ask at a certain point, but they couldn't immediately ask,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, that sounds like it's still in here. And, and so, wait, hold on. And then it goes on to say, unless there is an immediate threat to officer safety and the safety of others. So that's something that I don't think was actually covered in that text.
Yes, it was.
Was it? Okay,
Yeah.
well, good. And it's, however, officers can still check law enforcement databases to see if someone is on parole or probation. So, and then just the last paragraph, I'm just looking at this as a possible model on what we might spin off of or something like that to see if it makes sense. Police will not be allowed to conduct warrantless searches on somebody on probation or parole for a non-violent offense unless they can prove a so-called connection to criminal activity or a threat to officer or citizen safety. So I'm not sure again how that comes out in the actual policy, because there are sort of gaps in the
It
way you
is.
could interpret some of those things.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
I'd like to see
Okay.
the actual policy and see if it's different from this.
Right. So my question really is this, and your proposal was that they
Not to allow the
shall not
searches
search
absent suspicion.
those under supervised release and their vehicles, homes, pedestrians, absent reasonable suspicion based on articulable facts that illegal activity is taking place, right? That was your proposal.
Mhm.
So I'm just wondering, I have two questions about it, and to Lieutenant Montgomery, for just to start out. One is, if something like Oakland came about in Berkeley, or Kitty's proposal about reasonable suspicion based on our articulable facts were approved. So tell me again, you did a nice job last time in talking about the police officers' issues. Tell me again, what would be the danger, if any, to police officers, more than they have now, in adopting this kind of policy? Why would there be a danger to them?
Okay, so I'm going to backtrack a little bit because I think it'll be helpful. This language here about legitimate law enforcement purpose and the searches shall not be arbitrary, capricious, and harassing are kind of all throughout the case law. So there were several cases in the early 2000s where they were kind of struggling with, what is arbitrary, what is capricious, and should officers be doing it this way or that way when they're contacting probationers and trying to find out if they're on probation. So the case law eventually in the early 2000s becomes relatively settled about that, and that's business as usual for us.
Yeah.
So
That's nothing new.
that's nothing new. Okay. However, for discussion is that the way the state of California, the Supreme Court of California, and the Supreme Court of the United States looked at this case law is that the officers involving themselves in probation searches, routine suspicionless probation searches of probationers, as long as they're not arbitrary, capricious, or harassing, serves a legitimate law enforcement purpose.
Right.
Okay, so those statements don't undermine that these searches do not serve a legitimate purpose. And I kind of wanted to call that out to the group,
Right.
is that those searches of probationers. A probationer has entered into an agreement rather than being punished for a crime to submit to searches, and those searches are designed to keep them from reoffending and know that people are going to be checking on their activities so that they won't continue to commit the kind of crimes that got them in trouble in the first place. And those have public safety outcomes. Somebody who's not carrying a gun that would have carried a gun before because they think they may be searched if stopped has a public safety outcome that's difficult to measure, but there are public safety outcomes. And so the courts and our practices view police officers being involved in these searches as having legitimate law enforcement purpose.
Right.
So that's kind of like our starting place. So when you talk about the safety, there are a few things. And
let's when you're answering that, because this kind of muddies it up a little bit, let's go over to absent reasonable suspicion based on articulable facts.
Okay.
And so it's like, what would the danger be over and above what an officer is experiencing now if that were enacted?
So it's a little bit unworkable as worded because for a couple reasons. One, because by the time we've stopped somebody to talk to them, we've detained them, we've already been required to have reasonable suspicion that crime is afoot to make the detention in the first place.
Well, let's talk about a vehicle stop for a minor.
We've already had probable cause of a violation.
Okay.
So we were already in a place with the detention or the arrest in the case of a vehicle code violation. We're already in a place where an officer has reasonable suspicion and a detention, or probable cause that a vehicle code violation has been committed in front of them, and they're going to write a ticket, which is technically a very minor arrest for committing that violation. So
What we're talking about here is criminal activity. Should that be inserted in this then?
well, it almost speaks to what Elliot was talking about, where it envisions a situation where an officer rolls down their window, has no reason to stop somebody, and hollers out, "Hey, are you on probation? Oh, good, I'm getting out."
No, but I'm
You know what I
talking
mean?
about once
'Cause-
you stop
yeah.
them for a traffic offense. If we were to require that there be reasonable suspicion that there was criminal activity, contraband, let's say, in the car, I mean, how could we phrase it that it's not just about the traffic stop itself?
Yeah, so you could try to phrase it in such a way that you said there was some other on top of the traffic stop issue.
Mm-hmm.
However, That's the nature of contraband. The nature of contraband is that people try to hide it. that you may have no inkling that there's a gun in the car when there's a gun in the car. So it's the probation in the limited circumstances of people who've agreed to be searched, to submit to searches, and consented to those searches as a matter of going on probation, have consented to you being able to look for contraband in situations where you ordinarily would not be able to, where you would not ordinarily have cause to.
And so somebody who has contraband in the car, will they be honest with you when you ask them if they're on parole?
It's a range, some yes, some no.
Well, so you don't really depend on that, you then check.
Yeah, so what I would do, and this is what I was talking about questions I have, is I think you have two issues that are separable. The first issue is, let's talk about the question. Asking the question, how it makes people feel, how people leave the stop feeling, it sounds like I hear people saying that they feel wronged by the question, that they feel that the question isn't asked fairly. There's that issue.
It isn't.
Okay, I'm just...
If you're gonna ask it across the board.
Right, so I'm saying there's a whole conversation around that and how people feel about that, and I was hearing and listening to that at the last meeting. And then there's an issue of, well, do we want to change how probation works in Berkeley? Do we want to change how police use probation to keep the community safe?
Yeah.
Because this is a tool that has community safety outcomes. And so adding a higher level of scrutiny than case law, state law, adding that higher level of scrutiny will have public safety outcomes.
Okay, what about the danger to officers? Is there any difference that you see? I mean, you know, rather than say, you know, are you on probation or parole, you would have to, under this proposal, have reasonable suspicion based on whatever articulable facts are. That's a different question. That there was illegal activity going on.
Yes. So,
So what was the
if
danger?
it were above and beyond the original stop, because remember the original stop may be based on that's reasonable suspicion, but if it were, you're saying, I just stopped you for a brake light out, and now you need reasonable suspicion, articulable suspicion to conduct that this
Sure.
person is involved in a crime, to enact the terms of their probation, then what you're doing is you're nullifying the terms of their probation. The terms of their probation are that you do not have to have those things. So you're
I
nullifying.
understand
So
that,
what
but
that
I'm
does
just
is-
saying if
so-
it went to this.
Right, so here's where it impacts your safety.
Right.
So now, a person who you ordinarily would be able to, in today's date and time, according to the law, I can verify that they are not armed. Okay?
Mhm.
In this version, I will not be able to. I will not be able to find out if they're armed or not. That means for the rest of the stop, they will be able to maintain a weapon in their vehicle. And as long as they're able to maintain a weapon, then now the officer is at the mercy of their decision-making process.
So,
They could decide to then use that weapon. They may or may not. They may in very limited circumstances. It may not be very frequent. But now the officer does not control a factor that the law basically says that they can control, is whether or not we can find out whether somebody has a weapon or not when they are on probation. Another issue.
Is that the main concern then, or not, in terms of
Weapons is a major concern, and we talked about last week. There are issues of timing where, I don't want to blow things out of proportion and say, not doing it this way will get everybody killed or anything like that. But there are issues of timing in a stop. The sooner an officer can know that this is going to be the kind of stop where they're going to conduct a search, they can begin taking measures to conduct that search safely. They might get cover, they might not leave the car. Remember we talked about when officers are shot and killed on car stops, it's on approach and reapproach.
Right.
So when I know that somebody on the car was in probation, I would stay up at the car, I cut my approach and reapproach in half, I'm able to keep the eyes on somebody, and they in most cases they're not shooting, but what we know about stops is in order to create a safety, I wouldn't leave the car.
So
Right.
Lieutenant, if they're on probation, you have to know if the judge has imposed a search condition on that probationer. It's not enough to know they're on probation. You need to
Yes.
know that the judge has imposed that condition. So you need to go back to check the record or something.
Perhaps. So in the beginning of my career, that was true. They gave out all kinds of different probations in Alameda County. They gave out sort of a widely varying degree of search conditions. since then, the Alameda County courts, they have worked to standardize the probation conditions. So most people,
Most, but not all.
most like, and I high 90s, are
Mhm.
taking probation that at least has person vehicle effects. And then in some instances, people also have, in most instances, they also have their residence. Or
So you
real
search the
residence or
vehicle
real
without checking on the record?
What you're gonna, basically what you do is you will start taking precautions. You might ask people to step out of the vehicle, secure them, then run them, depending on what the probation's for or the circumstance. So the answer is it depends on the circumstances, but the point what I'm trying to make is that if the earlier you know that information, the earlier you begin to take
Right.
action on it,
Right.
and
So
that can provide a safety.
There's two things in reading a lot of stuff about this that I understand. The law enforcement rationale for doing this is one, officer safety, and the other is deterrent on the probation or parolee for further criminal activity, like if they know that they might be searched, that it deters them from carrying a weapon in their car or something like that.
Then I have something
And
to
so,
say.
yeah,
People are
let me-
being searched that are not on probation.
let me just finish.
Right.
Let me just finish.
Okay?
Oh,
And
they
then
are?
it's your turn.
Yes, they are.
Let me just finish. So California is one of only 9 states that allows this. It has among the highest recidivism rates in the country. So clearly this is not deterring. Second, there's no evidence that there's greater officer safety in California as a result of this. So it seems to me that offset against, I'm never gonna do balancing tests. There's 2 things that has to be set against. One is that we are basically eliminating a constitutional right for a large segment of the population. Is this worth it, given that we're only one of 9 states that does it? Second is the issue of implicit bias, which is, what a lot of this is about, or what a lot of this is motivated by, the concern with implicit bias. So the concern with implicit bias, together with the idea that we are denying the Fourth Amendment right to a large segment of the population, for what effect in terms of, I understand what you're saying, Lieutenant, but if you look at California up against the states that don't do this, we don't see that there's this huge benefit from it. Gwen?
I already said what I needed to say.
Oh, I didn't hear you though, I was too.
No, I said people are being searched that are not on probation and not on parole.
Mhm.
How does that work? I mean, what are
Well,
they?
I'm not the police.
Yeah.
They're stopping people, searching them that are not on probation, not on parole. So
Elliot, did
Yeah,
you?
Talk
it just
about
doesn't
that.
apply to parole
So-
or
Mhm.
So,
probation people.
Right.
They're
Just-
searching people, period.
If we can tackle this part of it, it'll make
Yeah.
it, yeah, Elliot?
so almost the implicit bias is a very important part of this.
Yeah.
Because, in this period that we did all of this work and gathered anecdotal evidence, and the people and the stops that we could talk to, almost every person said the first question was, are you on parole?
Mhm.
So, I wonder how many of, I know that since I've been in Berkeley, may have been stopped in either my wife's car or me for minor office, light out, license plate askew, and never asked that question. Or in a regular traffic stop, speeding or whatever, I never stopped, asked that
Me
question.
either.
So that's an important part of it. And as Winston said when we met with the chief, and this leads to the whole issue, we asked, last year's statistics, 52% of stops were African American. There were 6,000 stops, 52% were African American. And when we asked the chief about that, because we're trying to form the policy on searching, this disparity, his answer was that, well, 50% of the crime is African American. And that's not.
That's not true.
Well, I know, I'm just quoting. And that's not a sufficient answer. So, I just wanted to relay that information.
So I understand that, you know, obviously this is a people industry, right? It's people, officers coming to serve a community and you know, just human issues, right, of trying to figure out how to best serve your community. And I understand that there's biases that play a part in people's decisions, and we train our officers, you know, pretty rigorously to identify, you know, why they're doing things and making sure that it's just, and that's par for the course here. So I'm not, you know, people, I'm not disputing any of that.
No question.
I'm
For
not,
a lot of reasons.
yeah.
No question.
I'm not putting out sort of arguing with people's experience or anything of that nature. And in fact, I think people's experience or how they experience this question is relevant. Okay, and I'm also not saying it when you know, because I'll take the time to explain to you sort of the nuts and bolts of the little ways that it helps, that it could make officers safe. That Ms. Calavita is wrong, that it's still a balancing test. We're still going to put that on the scale and go, how important is that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I'm
so,
just,
right.
feeling as one side outweighs the other.
So I think it personally would be better to deal with the issue of the question and asking the question, and then we're further apart on the issue of the searches and trying to basically change the law around searching on probation and parole. We're pretty far apart. For example, I mean, I know Oakland just passed their the resolution from the commission, but that was after almost a year and a half of negotiation, and they still have not gone through a meet and confer with the union, and it still has not been approved by the independent police auditor. So it's not practiced yet. It's been approved by the council, but there's still process. So
I thought it had been
I think
gone through the union, didn't it?
It hadn't. So I did have some questions about scope. So depending on how and why this commission was established, this commission was established because as a result of the council saying the PRC should look into the issue of the question.
No, it came up.
Yeah.
Right.
To be honest, it came up as a result of anyway.
For me, here's where I come down. One is, I think your idea about the question is good. How would we handle that if it were going to be asked at all? But two is, on the officer safety side, I think, you know, I don't want to be involved in inventing something that would be a lot riskier to officer safety. On the other hand, giving up what might be what I would call, what would I call it? Giving up the fact that you might discover something on a stop that would prevent a criminal activity later because the guy's carrying a gun or something, even though he's not threatening you.
I would submit to you that the officer safety impact is one thing.
Yeah,
but
you know, for me, those stats aren't available, so we don't know how either if your ability to ask this question really does make the community safer as a whole, because we don't have any stats about, well, gee, you know, there were this many stops and this many things that happened that could have resulted in a criminal activity later. So to me, it's more like, well, it comes down to officer safety and asking the question, and I think that is the most important thing. I would be willing to give up the ancillary benefit of saying, well, you know, by asking this question, I'm making the community as a whole safer. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Because of what they find when they ask the question.
I'm not sure what you're saying. You'd be willing to give up what?
The so-called as Lieutenant Montgomery was talking about, the so-called making the community safer because we would find something on contraband that would make, because we discovered it, it would make the community safer.
Right.
That to me, I would be willing to give up because we don't have any stats really supporting what those numbers would look like. You know, it's like, well, gee, if you found something on somebody, does that mean that they were going to commit a criminal act later or something like that? You see what I mean?
The logic
But it
of
does
also-
make a difference to me is if the officer walks up to the car and is going to be somehow impacted a lot more than they are now. It's already a tough place to be. If you walk up to a car, you don't know what's going to come out of that car, and that would make a difference to me. And asking the question, I think we have to deal with. How would we deal with asking the question?
It would seem to me, if I were a parolee and had a weapon in the car, and you stopped me for a traffic stop, and you treated it like a traffic stop, and you said, Ms. Calavita, you were speeding, give me the ticket, I think, phew, and I carry on. But if you start asking me, am I on parole, and I know I've got a gun in the car, I would become more agitated and more likely to harm the officer than if you simply treated it like a traffic stop.
Yeah,
Isn't that?
No, that's.
How is that
I don't know
not?
if that
Okay,
works
so
that way.
yeah,
I don't know why.
So I could.
I've seen people get agitated when they're asked this question, and
I understand that, but what I guess my answer to that would be, really, there's all kinds of ranges of responses. That there's no pat or predictable response. Maybe a parolee is having a bad day, and maybe they have a mental health breakdown that day. Maybe they think that all kinds of things are happening that aren't happening. The point is, everybody we meet is themselves in that day and in that moment, and they make choices based on a lot of things that we can't know or predict. And so we basically take control of the stop. Part of taking control of the stop and asking questions is verifying that somebody's participating and cooperating, verifying that they're telling the truth that's verifiable to you when you're talking to them and you're doing a mini investigation. They may react 100 different ways for 100 different reasons.
how do you explain this article about the study in Oakland, the new policy in Oakland from the East Bay Times talks about Eberhardt's study. Of all probation and parole searches by Oakland police were African American Hispanic, 93%. Whereas it's only 53% blacks and Hispanics in Oakland.
Okay, so it's been.
You could argue.
It's been probably 2 years since I read the Eberhardt study. We're talking about Oakland, not Berkeley.
Yeah.
We're also talking about the population of probation and parole is the people who have pled to a crime and a probation condition as part of their sentence in the county of Allamby. Those statistics are available online. Who is walking around in that status of having pled and consented to searches?
You're saying it's 93%?
You look it up right now.
California prisons are 1/3.
I'm not talking about California prison. I'm talking about Alameda County probation rolls. They put, it's a matter of public record, the demographics of people who have pled to a crime and submitted to a probation as part of their plea arrangement.
Okay.
That's available, and so I don't.
Well,
I'm not calling that a good thing or anything like that. I'm just saying.
yeah. I don't believe it's 93%, but anyway.
Yeah, but what I think we should be talking about, because we do have some information, is Berkeley, or where it's difficult for us. I don't think we should be making.
Okay, we don't need to talk about Oakland, but we have Berkeley statistics that show that blacks are 4 times more likely to be searched than whites, and that whites are found more often with illegal activity in their car.
Right. I just think we're talking about. Oakland is a different municipality. They're a different department, run a slightly different way. They're not exactly the same as Berkeley. I'm proud of the work that Berkeley Police Department does, and we're making rules for the Berkeley Police Department.
But yeah, given the statistics we've seen, Berkeley does better than probably Oakland, but there's still this disparity.
Yeah, according to CPE, they had measured over 200 agencies, and Berkeley was the lowest disparity they've ever measured in a police agency.
Right, but still disparate. So that's what we're trying to tackle here, and
Yeah,
I'm
no.
wondering, we could be a leader in the nation, not on the nation, because we're behind the nation on this particular issue.
There's room
But
for
we,
improvement.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting we pop a bubbly and.
Oakland at
yeah.
this point in time in history is not good to compare against Berkeley, to me.
Different communities.
I feel it's a lot better office than the Berkeley Police Department than Oakland. The writers, incidents, and the whole activities that in the past few years that have been documented about the, so that isn't a good example to just be like Oakland.
no,
We don't want it to be like
nobody's
Oakland.
saying that.
Yeah, I would just point out that we're different communities in a lot of ways,
So-
and our police department community is different too.
But in all these statistics, when people are stopped and it's found that they didn't do anything and there was no crime or anything like that, you know, is there ever an instance where there's an accountability for who makes all these stops of African American and Hispanic folks for no reason? Are their names kept? Is there a way to say, well, this officers might need some more, you know?
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is we have what's called an early warning system.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
so we have an early warning system.
Stats are kept on who?
So when we do analysis on car stop data,
Right.
we do disaggregated
Right.
car stop data. So we look at the department, the performance of the department. But that wouldn't preclude if we had an issue with somebody addressing that issue. So if somebody were, it came to our attention that they were, abusing a certain community for a certain reason, we would address that issue one-on-one. But when we look at our car stop statistics, we use disaggregated data because that's what helps us basically line up the culture of the community, or the culture of the department with the community.
Mm-hmm. But is there ever a time that the data might suggest that certain officers are more likely to be stopping folks for no reason, and that those people are identified, or that is that stat is kept of the who is doing it? But it seems like if it happens often enough and it's the same folks, then
Yeah.
that
We-
needs
so-
to be.
We have other accountability mechanisms that we use to do that, training mechanisms. But we have other accountability mechanisms other than, because you could imagine if, let's say you were a police officer and you worked in a certain neighborhood and that neighborhood consisted of a certain group of people, and it gave the appearance that you were doing illegitimate police work when you were doing perfectly legitimate police work. It's very difficult to sort of strip away all the facts and circumstances of all these stops and then take it to an officer and say, numbers here look like you're racist, buddy.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very problematic and difficult situation to use the numbers that way. So we use them in a broader way to talk about the department and the community.
Elliot.
So, let me just ask you a question. In talking to the chief and various officers along the way, we understand that the police department is not reading the stop data that's collected because of a lot of reasons, but they're not reading it, and that's why they gave it to the CPE and got the recommendation. But you're not specifically reading it within the department.
So the way that stops happen sort of all throughout the year, it's not particularly illuminating to see the disposition code until you have a large aggregate of data. Then it becomes more informative. And then, because the issues are complex, we did bring in an outside agency that specializes in analyzing that data.
But you have almost 5 years of data now.
We've been collecting data my entire career. Yeah.
And
You're
you
just
were
what?
collecting data before that.
Yeah, we've been,
But
yeah.
the new codes were 5 years old.
Yeah.
With probably more information, but that's the impression we got and the feedback we get from the police department.
So now it's approaching noon, and I'd like to ask the committee how you all would like to proceed.
Can you Oh, anyway, go ahead.
No, what were you gonna say? Can we?
I'm looking back at the Oakland language,
Mhm.
and basically, if they use something similar, this was in the last report we got,
Right.
it's actually out of their general order draft. Who knows if they approved it or not, but it was still about immediately, right? It says that
Yeah.
officers shall not immediately inquire whether an individual is on supervised release unless there's an immediate threat to officer safety or safety of others. And it says, and any subsequent inquiries about probation and parole, blah, 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 status shall be framed in a respectful manner. That was their language.
Mhm.
So, that still leaves a bit to be desired.
Yes, I think
From
it's.
my standpoint,
It's.
about specifics, but, they're leaving the door open to ask it for some reason or another,
Right.
one reason or another, because they're thinking it has a legitimate law enforcement purpose.
This is, I'm not sure you have this is what we got,
Okay.
this is
This
the
is- let's
draft
see
of
if I
the
have another
policy that
copy of this.
apparently city council passed.
Oh,
Christine,
okay.
you might have, it was passed out last time.
Yeah.
I
It looks
didn't
like
bring
this.
anything with me.
I have it.
Do you have a fresh one?
This
think so,
says
but-
attachment 9A
I need
online.
that back.
Okay.
Is that
Yeah.
the one you have, 9A?
There's no reason we have to follow their language. I actually think it leaves a lot to be desired
Yeah,
because, as
but-
Lieutenant pointed out, the searches are already considered for legitimate law enforcement purpose, and already there's a law against arbitrary, capricious, or harassing searches. So that part, the search part, except that it says, you can't search unless the parole was based on a non-violent felony. That's different. But you can still ask the question and follow it up with a search if it's for a violent felony 20 years ago.
Now, I have one other question. I'm focusing in on Kitty's language here that she had proposed about absent reasonable suspicion.
So
That's
just
on-
before number 2,
That's on the thing you see on,
so the language.
it's this
is
one
on-
she handed out today, and it's on,
Okay, so what's the date on it? Because I have this, did you make any,
I
This
made
says
some
July.
changes in
but
July.
I can't tell which, is
The
this
change-
current?
if you look at page 2, I don't think that's changed. If you look at page 2,
This is the new one. That's
This
the
is
new one.
This is the
Yeah,
current one,
yeah.
okay, great.
And
So you
so,
look at
The one that
page
was on the
2.
table.
page 2, just before the
The one that
second.
was on the table.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Right.
If you look at page 2,
Okay.
it's the second,
The
her proposal is in bold there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so that's the proposal that she's saying, that the officers shall not search those under supervised release and their vehicles, homes, pedestrian, blah, blah, absent reasonable suspicion based on articulable facts that illegal activity is taking place.
And I would change the language based on what Lieutenant said.
Based on what?
I would change the language a little bit based on what the
Okay,
lieutenant
but I'm just trying to
said.
get to
Yeah.
the notion. And that would be, so if that was the case, I just have one last question, then you guys can go where you want with this. What does that mean to you, in terms of a stop? What would be reasonable suspicion based on articulable facts and illegal activity is taking place? I mean, how would you judge that if you were gonna say, well, I'm either outside of this law or I'm inside of the law?
It essentially, that essentially negates the ability to do a probation or parole search.
Yeah.
So the way I would judge that is that if I had those things, I wouldn't need probation or parole.
Right.
So
If you had what thing?
if I had idea that there was a crime afoot or I needed to remove
Oh,
somebody
yeah.
from a vehicle, I would not need probation or parole.
Right.
I would already be at a search.
Mhm.
So it's basically elevating. What it's essentially doing is it's elevating a probation or parole search to the requirements of a probable cause search.
Mhm.
And what it does is it nullifies search activity or probation and parole enforcement. And using a search as a legitimate law enforcement purpose of probation and parolees. It means that a lot of contraband and a lot of weapons are going to be left in kind of running around in the community. It also means that people who would victimize the community are going to, once they become sort of wise to that, they are going to be less reluctant to leave their guns at home.
Lieutenant, though, I have a problem with that because the logic of that it improves public safety. If you take that logic to its conclusion, that would argue for stopping people at any time, not on the pretext of a traffic stop, but just walking down the street. That would improve public safety too, according to your logic. It would get weapons off the street. I mean,
So
what's happening here is that you're using a traffic stop as a way to find these weapons on parolees and probationers.
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is,
Well, but the logic of what you're saying is because it gets guns off the street. By that logic, you could also just willy-nilly stop anybody.
no, you cannot. So I'm not saying that, and that is not the logic that I'm expressing. What I'm saying is that the state of California, the way the laws have been written and affirmed by the courts, see it as a legitimate law enforcement purpose for law enforcement officers to engage in probation and parole searches. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes when we engage in those searches, we find contraband that would be dangerous to the public.
Right.
In some of those, if you basically outlaw probation and parole searches through a stroke of the pen in California, then in those instances, we would no longer recover those weapons, and they would pose
understand what you're
some,
saying.
I don't
Yeah.
know how much, risk to the public.
So when is a
That was
probation
the
and
part I was
when
talking
is a
about
probation
getting
and
at.
parole search legal for you?
A probation and parole search?
When is it legal?
A probationer must submit to search day or night
Yes,
of
I
the
know,
person
but
placed.
given that they have,
Yeah.
when is it legal for you to search them?
Anytime, day or night.
Anytime with no reason.
That's right. Because
That's what I'm saying.
yeah.
You can stop them
That's right.
anytime and ask them if they're on probation or parole.
The courts.
You don't need the excuse of a traffic stop.
No, what I'm saying is the courts have lowered the by an agreement.
I
They've
understand.
lowered the threshold for search below the threshold of a probable
I
cause
understand. I
or a
understand.
warranted search.
I understand. I understand the law. I'm asking you, given what you're saying, that increases public safety because it gets guns off the street, by that same logic, or according to that same rationale, you ought to be able to stop people anytime for no reason and
anytime.
ask if they're on parole.
No,
or
I'm not.
Why are
asking-
you able to ask a motorist when you stop them for a light being out? Why are you able to ask them if they're on parole and probation at that moment and not when they're walking down the street?
Well, I didn't say you couldn't when they're walking down the street.
Okay,
So what I'm saying
so
is,
She's
this-
saying you
Yeah,
could ask
yeah.
at any time of
Yeah,
any
you
You
bite.
could ask anytime, day or night.
anytime you came into contact with somebody right now, you could ask any
Right.
kinds of questions you want to ask. If I just had a consent, there's no sort of
Right.
rules or laws that say you can't ask this question, you can't ask that
Right.
question.
But
We're
you don't-
using our judgment and we're asking questions. Some of
Amber
them.
alert, probably.
Yeah.
What is it?
Probably an Amber alert.
Investigative questions that help us manage the stop.
I'm just pushing that logic. I think none of us would like it if the police were stopping people outside of a traffic
Arbitrary.
stop, just walking down the street. But it's allowed by law.
What you're describing is
It doesn't
a
happen.
different hypothetical state of being that's not our current state of being. Our current state of being is that it is lawful for officers to make contacts, consensual contacts. It's lawful for them to make detention,
Yes.
to ask them questions, to ask them who they
So
are.
why isn't it lawful to stop somebody on the street and ask them if they're on parole?
In order to stop somebody on the street, meaning they're not free to leave, you would have to have reasonable suspicion that crime is afoot and that person's part of the crime.
Why is that different from a motorist?
In the case of a motorist, it could be either that, or it could be that there's probable cause to believe that they've committed a crime. For example, the offense of running a stop sign. Okay, those are technically vehicle code violations, technically crimes,
Okay.
and you're stopping somebody based on probable cause that they committed a vehicle code violation. But you also could stop a car based on reasonable suspicion that, for example, I gave last week, somebody's coming out of the back of a bank parking lot at 2 a.m. And the alarm's going off. a reasonable officer would say this might be a burglary of a bank.
Is
It's like
there-
a reasonable suspicion stop, not a vehicle code violation.
Is there any way we can tinker with this policy that would satisfy you?
So, the issue of basically raising the bar to say that we will not conduct suspicionless probation and parole searches is a much bigger issue than I believe, we're giving credit for yet, especially in terms of public safety. Let me give you another example, not guns, not alarming, like, not dangerous, okay? We have all the time, people who are put on probation for stealing mail. Okay, they steal mail and they collect profiles of people. Let me just finish. They collect profiles of people, and then they victimize people by stealing, looting their identity.
Yeah.
They open credit cards, they run up credit cards, and then somebody's stuck with the bill.
I
okay?
understand this.
So they take probation conditions,
I
and
understand.
to be searched.
Yeah. I
We will
think
never find those people carrying all those profiles by serving a search
We
condition.
need to move forward.
Okay, I had one last thing on this, because the only other thing I can think of that would strike a balance, which, you know, it gets, I'm not sure if it does, is that we found out last time that you could, when you go back, you can go back to your car, you can run a search on somebody and find out if they're on probation or parole. Then you know. The risk is going back.
It's the time. It's just timing.
It's going back
You would
to
take
the
different-
car, and then all of a sudden they've
They can
had
do that
time.
before they even get to the car. If they're behind you, they've already called in your license plate, they already.
Well,
know
but the
who
license
you
plate
are.
may not be the person.
But they've
right.
already
You
called it in,
know the
so they
license
know who
plate.
the owner is.
But if
it's-
you,
it
I could be
a
driving.
man or a woman. If they see it's somebody else, then obviously they can assume that maybe the car is stolen, or maybe
Yeah.
they've loaned the car out or whatever, but you can go by the license plate.
Right.
You don't have to walk up and ask somebody, are they on probation or parole?
No, I understand that.
And if you're going to do it, like I said at the last meeting, ask everyone.
Yeah,
Okay?
and
Don't
so I
just
was trying to
ask
find a
African
way they
Americans
wouldn't, and I'm,
people of color, ask
Yeah.
you, and everybody else.
yeah,
That's the only fair way to do it.
yeah, well, I was
We
trying
can keep going
to
around
find a
and
way
around.
they,
I know.
But the bottom line is going to stay the same. It's being done. And it's not impacting you, and it's not impacting your children, but it's impacting the community of color, and we don't like it.
yeah, I understand. I
Okay,
was trying to
that's
find
the
a
bottom
way
line.
that they could run the check and
Right.
confirm they are either on or not, and have that be more of the policy, so that they'll know if they're on or not. Then the question becomes is what risk is that gonna be to the officer? So it seems like to me, that's the only other place to go, rather than saying, you can't, well, I guess you could say you can't ask the question, you'd have to confirm it in a search,
But that
in a
doesn't treat the
record search.
question, that doesn't treat the question of the searches themselves. The fact that the searches themselves are disparate.
Well, yeah, but now you're, to me, that's a little different issue. I mean, it's like,
Well, they're related.
well, to me though, asking the question is the insulting thing in the community, right? I mean, that's what the community's reacting to, I think, is, well, wait a minute, you guys are asking this of everyone? It's like, please, give me a break. And so what I'm trying to say is, well, if we do the records check, then they're asking it, they're gonna be dealing with somebody they know is on probation or parole.
The problem, Terry, is that they're not gonna do the record check on me. They're gonna do the record check on the same people they've been asking.
Yeah,
Okay, so we'd still have disparate outcomes. If they see me driving down the street for a minor traffic offense, I don't think they're gonna look up and see if I'm on parole.
yeah.
It doesn't solve anything to require them to check the record base,
Right.
because the check would still impact certain communities.
Right.
Elliot had something. I think.
I just wanna make a comment. As I understand it from the research, that as I said, there's only 9 states that require this. That, in the other states.
They allow this. Yeah.
That allow this. In the other states, that there is no measurable, increase in crime or safety, as a result of this law change. So there should be some model policies out there, including the Oakland one, that, you know, we can follow. That, you know, because it's always, not only in Berkeley or California, it's always been a bias issue. And the bias, as we've stated before, comes from our society. So,
Well, I think, you know, I think that we need to move forward with some motion, and I feel like we might have two alternative motions on the floor, I don't know, I suspect we might have two alternatives. We're gonna lose, Commissioner Roberts at the end of this month, because he's retiring from the commission.
I'm not retiring, I'm leaving the commission.
Retiring from your hard work on the commission. Anyway, I would like to put forward my dual proposals here as stated in this document. And I will be open to friendly amendments or substitute motions. I put this forward. Are there any seconds?
Your
My
thing
dual.
in bold here.
Well, maybe we should take them one by one. Number one.
Oh, number one.
Number
Oh,
one
okay.
is about the searches. I would change the language to read based on absent reasonable suspicion based on articulable facts that illegal activity beyond the traffic offense or offense for which people were originally stopped. Well, that doesn't make sense, does it?
I don't think you're.
I think I'd just
comfortable
say
with-
absent reasonable suspicion.
What page are you looking at?
This is the, here.
I'm looking at this, but
It's
you're working
the
from
bold is
my proposal.
the bold is the proposal.
Right, okay.
And so I would limit the officers, limit basically these fourth waiver searches, which would draw the Fourth Amendment from a large segment of the population and show disparate numbers of searches in communities of color. This would bring California into line with 32 other states, including Nevada and Oregon. That would be my first proposal. And, you know, this is my proposal. I know it won't probably withstand meet and confer and other instances in the hierarchy, but I believe in putting forward the proposal that I believe in and then take it from there. I suspect it will be watered down. I would hope not, but I suspect it would be if we were to pass it.
It's a good attempt.
Yeah, it's a first attempt. But if it doesn't have a second, it's not going anywhere.
I think we're not at workable yet language. We're not at language that we can use to instruct officers. We're not at language
We're
that will
not
be clear.
anywhere near that point
No,
yet.
it's
It'll
more
go-
of a-
it's- This is
more
just
of a
for the
notion.
committee.
Yeah.
It'll go to the commission next, and then it will go to the department.
I'm a little confused here because you're saying it would be in line with Nevada and Oregon, but I don't see where Nevada is listed under an alternative with Oregon. And I'm looking to see where Nevada falls in this.
Nevada's in the first paragraph
Okay.
together with most other states. I
Okay.
named Nevada and Oregon because they are neighbors.
Okay, so
Is that,
I think we
Reasonable
probably
suspicion
should have
is
left Nevada out.
well,
because-
that's not part of the proposal, it was just, that's not
It's
in
just a
bold.
comment.
That's just a
Okay.
comment.
Gotcha,
The comment is about 32 other states.
okay.
We'd be in line with 32 other states, and I mentioned those two because they're near us.
Yeah.
Currently, we're together with Arizona, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Texas, Tennessee, Virginia, Wisconsin. Those are the states.
What's wrong with alternative 3?
What do you mean alternative?
I mean, what I'm looking
what
at.
Alaska and North Carolina do?
Yeah.
Because that requires a request by a parole officer, which, that would be fine with me, but I doubt, I'd rather not have, those don't do, that means that if you do a traffic stop, you're not allowed to search. You'd have to
Right.
contact the parole officer, et cetera, et
Exactly.
cetera, yeah. That could be a possibility.
Mhm.
Well, I'm sort of impressed by the data, but until you look at each one of their laws, you don't really know what that consists of. I mean, that's kind of lumped into one group.
I have a whole lot of
And-
other, if you wanna see my 10 pages on
Yeah,
this.
but I'm
it
just saying, I mean,
describes
it isn't,
Right.
maybe the way.
All I can tell you is that we're one of only 9 states that
I
allow
read that, yeah, I don't like the
suspicious
9 that
searches.
we're associated with,
Yeah.
actually.
And in 2006, we were the only one.
Yeah, I
We were the
understand,
only
no,
one.
I understand that, yeah,
So-
I don't really like
Yeah, I
that.
agree with you too.
Yeah.
But as you know, by our discussion here, we're quibbling around with the language here. The state's laws actually could be a little different than each other.
You're right.
Oh,
as
yes,
it-
they
as
are.
it-
Yeah.
As it relates
Right.
to
I've-
the actual wording of the thing,
Right.
I've summarized
which could
it.
open or close more loopholes, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Anyway,
Well, if I'm not getting a second, does anybody have an alternative proposal?
I'm just
I'll
trying to
second your,
think about
yours with, the question as to, maybe we can, look at some of these, maybe a few of them, perhaps like Alaska, North Carolina, and maybe,
You have an extra copy of that from the previous meeting, right?
let's is this one?
Which
No,
one?
this is from today.
the agenda.
This is
Oh,
the
it's
agenda,
in
do you
the
have the
agenda.
agenda?
Okay.
Yeah, it's on the
What
second,
page?
the third page. Maybe look at that too, maybe Alaska or North Carolina, what their policy is, and then maybe one more,
I would be interested in seeing those 10 pages you had on
Okay.
your research, that'd be great.
and I don't know, another one, maybe if someone has an idea which other, state to look at. I'm really surprised with North Carolina in this. I would expected them to be along with California, but.
Well, maybe they haven't gotten around to it. Like I said, 10 years ago, we were alone.
Yeah.
well, you're saying look at the one there in yellow, the third one?
Right. Mhm.
Says reasonable suspicion not required for a search
If it's asked
by
by
a
the parole
police officer.
Mhm.
Parole
Only
officer.
when search is requested by a parole officer.
In which case, it's not clear why the parole officer doesn't do it, but anyway.
Yeah.
I wouldn't support that myself.
Commissioner
because I
Calavita,
think-
can I borrow your system?
Yeah, I feel like we're blending two questions. One of them that's probably we're closer to being able to resolve with an issue that is really, really a tougher issue that should require more input. We should probably have probation out here. We should probably know more experts. We should probably look hard at the probation search data.
Right.
Because we do collect data on whether or not a search was conducted because of probation or parole. That's in our dispo code.
Well, I missed what you said, though. I was out of the room. What did you say?
We collect data on our car stops and our ped stops
Yeah,
that
I
indicates.
got that part, but what did you proceed that with?
I
That
just-
that could be useful?
Yeah, I think the second question, the question of should we change how BPD engages or doesn't engage in suspicious searches,
It's on
that's a
the
separate
back.
question we're really far apart on. I think we could probably do some
Yeah.
good work around it,
Right here.
but I get the sense that you guys want to just sort of get this over with, and I think that these are really important issues.
Yeah,
And I think we haven't had near the sort of stakeholder input. I mean, I couldn't even give you one story or example without sort of being up against our deadlines, and I think these are tall orders and important issues we should be talking about. And that's to hear from the community and to hear how it would actually be implemented and to get to good language. So that's
Well,
my input.
This is a first stab. It's going to the commission after this. Community input could happen there. We'll have a long discussion at the commission, you can be sure. It seems like community input would be more relevant there.
But also
we wanna-
expert input.
What's that?
I think this discussion would benefit from expert input.
Of what sort?
People, we can invite somebody from probation or parole to come out and tell you about the benefits and the purposes, talk about recidivism.
Invite Jennifer Eberhardt to come and tell us about bias.
I would like that.
Yeah.
Well, I doubt that she will.
Yeah, but I'm just saying,
Anyway.
before we start bringing all these other people
Yeah.
to the table.
It seems to me that, I don't know, Gwen, you're asking for more research on what these other states do, or more,
Maybe
distribute that
just-
information.
Yeah, maybe just, pick one from each, category.
Well, we don't need to pick one from the top, because it's pretty straightforward. They don't allow fourth waiver searches. Fourth waiver searches are those that,
Right,
yeah.
sure.
And these others, the second section there, there's some alternative standard to reasonable suspicion. And the third one is upon request by a parole officer. I can get that information to you all if you want that, what I have. But I think we ought to put on hold that particular proposal.
Okay.
I'd withdraw it for the moment.
Okay.
And let's discuss the second one about.
On the first one though, to me, I mean, the overall notion of doing that, I might be able to support if there were, more language to identify what would actually happen and why and how that, so that we would be able to know what the language was going to be. I mean, this is a concept would be okay with me, but it's like I think we need to get a little more input on what the implications would be, what we would propose as more the language. If we get input from whoever about the problems with this, that we maybe could cover it in a little more language. So that would be my thinking about it.
And can you be specific about how we would do that?
I think I would probably just need more input from, maybe we would get some experts, maybe we would, do whatever to make sure that, this would be a reasonable thing to do. I'm not convinced it would be a reasonable thing to do at this point. Just in its one line.
I tend to be
32
succinct.
states support enough?
What's
Pardon?
that?
Isn't 32 states support enough?
Yeah.
I mean, there's no evidence that first of all,
No.
we have among the highest recidivism rates in the country, so it's clearly not producing public safety or anti-criminal activity.
But my point is that even in the 32 states, we don't know exactly what the regulations are. I mean, they could be lumped into something that would be, that's what I'm more interested in, is if it's, there could be caveats in the language in those states that weaken it or something, or even though it says without absent reasonable suspicion. So I'm impressed by that. I mean, I think that's why for me, it's more like, well, heading down that road would be a good thing to do. It's just the devil's in the detail for me. Maybe, do you have
need to
any
know which-
language on
I have some,
on
but I don't know
a few
that
of these states that are
I have some information on them. I don't know that I have the detail from every single 50 states.
No, I'm
what their
talking about a
policy
few
says.
sample ones to see if they're pretty much in line with your one line thing, and that is it's just kind of carte blanche,
Yeah.
or that they write things in that are caveats. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And if they're sort of all carte blanche, one line, and that's what they have in their law, then that makes a difference to me of what, or whether or not they
Um,
say they have that and then they, find a way to do caveats later.
I'll tell you what I think I know about this, and
Yeah.
that is that one reason that there's so many states that don't allow it is because this was basically not allowed until 2006 in Sampson versus California. Sampson versus because prior to Sampson versus California validated suspicionless searches of parolees or probationers by any law enforcement officer at any time or any place. And prior to that, it was not allowed unless it was by a parole officer or with suspicion or some other circumstance. And therefore, it's pretty straightforward in these other states. It's not allowed unless it's a parole and probation officer or unless there's some suspicion. And it's pretty much, I mean, I suspect possibly that some of these states will be going in the direction of California, you know?
Yeah, the issue is a practical one. So when they changed these laws and they changed how, basically once it was affirmed, this was a practice in California before Sampson.
Right.
It was validated by the Supreme Court
Right.
in Sampson. And what actually happened as a matter of course is that there are less probation and parole officers servicing the state because local police departments and sheriff's departments are carrying that load, that responsibility. Because we see it as a legitimate law enforcement purpose and we have by law been involved in that enforcement, there are less parole and probation agents, period, in the state of California. In other states where it's required, they staff accordingly so that their caseloads are manageable.
Okay, so if you want me to distribute what research I have on these other states, I'll do that. I'm not sure it's gonna move us forward, but anyway, I'll do that.
Or if
And-
you had a few,
Just a
that
few,
would
Yeah.
make a difference to
Well,
me.
yeah.
We don't need 30
I
states.
have something on every state, but I could pick a couple and look at it more.
To see, I'm just looking to see consistency there.
Yeah.
If it's across the board or if people.
And in terms of the language of how it's gonna be phrased in more legalistic terms, if I do this other homework, could one of the two of you do that?
And maybe if we can get a copy of, the Oakland, exactly what their language was.
Mhm.
I mean, we're seeing bits and pieces, you know, I wanna see what the language that
Right.
they presented to move this forward and to
Right.
get it approved by the city council.
Do you wanna look
Maybe
for
I
that?
could, yeah, maybe I can go online or something.
Or maybe Byron, he's a source of information on
Yeah, he
some of this.
probably could know.
I'm sure it's available, it's just hard to get it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, do you wanna tackle this question of the question?
Was that your next item,
Yes. It's in bold,
number 2?
yeah, but it's
Yeah.
also here.
Mhm.
So I proposed that they not make those inquiries absent some suspicion. Because of the way it opens up the potential for implicit bias. And the negative procedural justice ramifications. We haven't talked about procedural justice today, but that's about respect. And procedural justice is something that the Berkeley Police Department is committed to, and this is a strong element of that. So my proposal is that they not make such inquiries. The Oakland policy that's recently been put on the road to passing is that they not make the inquiry immediately. And frankly, I'm not sure what that achieves.
Yeah, I mean, they're leaving
mean,
it open.
They're leaving it completely open.
Mhm.
It's just not the first question, it might be the fourth. I don't see why that's
Right.
frankly such an advance. That's my proposal, does anybody second it?
I second it.
Do do you believe it needs different language?
I don't see a problem with the language here. What do you think?
I
Ed?
sense some hesitancy in my committee about it. Are we not ready for this,
I'm ready.
Terry?
Shall not make such inquiries. Is that verbal? Or they can't check the records, or what?
It's verbal.
Where is that in your?
Yes, please.
It's in bold on the third page.
Given this
Third
context.
page,
Yeah, right,
here.
right there.
Just given this one.
My purpose in both of these proposals is to recognize the problem of implicit bias, not just in the police department, but in all of us. And, you know, training doesn't necessarily do the trick. What's important is to have policies in place that inhibit the materializing of biases into practice. That's my whole agenda here. And if we leave discretion in these areas completely open, it allows for implicit biases to affect practice, to affect behavior. And so it seems to me that good governance is about installing practices that inhibit the ability to act on one's biases. And when I see the statistics, there may be reasons for the disparities that the police department has shared and so forth. But when we see the disparities, and Berkeley's better than most places, but across the country and frankly around the world, statistics show that people of color are disproportionately stopped, frisked, searched, arrested, and imprisoned. And, you know, it's true that there's more people under supervision in California who are people of color, but I won't go on about that.
Okay, well, here's, you know, this, the way you stated it, it's just absolute. And so we definitely have to make sure that it's about, you know, not about the records. Plus Oakland even caveats it. Basically, they say, officers shall not immediately inquire whether there is an whether an individual is on supervised release unless there's an immediate threat to officer safety or the safety of others.
You know, I had that in the initial version, the immediate safety and stuff before, but in that case, there would be a reasonable suspicion, you know, that something's going on. So I wouldn't mind adding that to this, that thing about safety.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly.
I took it off because it didn't seem to add anything.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what the practical implications would be.
I'm opposed to
Sure.
adding the qualification that Oakland has, that you can ask it later but not write it first. I don't see that that solves anything.
Yeah, it
Absolutely.
doesn't.
Yeah.
So there's one aspect in the case law that I found kind of interesting that I sent to you, and that was that the person has to knowingly be on probation.
You mean the officer has to know?
No,
The individual has to
the
know.
individual has to be knowingly on probation or parole. It's in the case law I sent you, and
Mhm.
the mechanics of determining whether they know. Ultimately, I mean that I have to confirm with the person at some point that they are in fact on probation or parole. If they said I didn't know, then we would have to go about proving that they knew. Now, as a practical matter, it's like it's a question and an answer, and it's over. Or you know, hey, you know you're on probation, you're searchable, right? Yeah, okay, and then we conduct our stop. But there is something in the case law that demands knowledge of probation for the search itself to be valid.
Right, but now we're talking about the question. So I would amend my proposal here such that it reads, officers shall not make such inquiries unless there's an immediate threat to the safety of the officer.
They
To
say,
make it
or the safety
consistent.
of others.
Or the safety of the officer or others. That's how it would read. BPD officers shall not make such inquiries unless there's an immediate threat to the safety of the officer or others.
Yeah, and I'm not even, the more I think about that language, it does kind of give some flexibility in there, but also I'm not sure what the practical aspects of that really are. I mean, can you think of a situation where, Lieutenant Montgomery, where there would be a threat situation where it would help to ask the question if they're on probation or parole? I mean, how would that play out in your mind?
That's the reason I dropped it. It was hard to imagine that.
The threat to others is probably more, a threat to us, we are gonna act on without that information.
Right.
We're gonna
Right.
intercept that threat. The hypothetical threat downstream, somebody going to harm others, maybe, for situations.
Mm-hmm.
I think the big conversation here, the question here is just knowing how it impacts a person to be asked that question and feel a certain way that you've only been asked for a certain reason, and really training cops to know that it's like this tool is not received the same by everybody. That some people.
But you're not giving it to everybody. But you keep saying that, and it's not true.
No, what I'm not saying.
That bothers me.
That's not what I'm saying. What I said is that the question is not received the same by everyone.
But you're not saying it to everyone. That's all I
We're
want
not
you
even
to-
saying it most of the time. We're not asking this
Well,
question very often.
Maybe you're not, but it's being said
What
on a
I'm-
regular basis. So it's
Yeah.
just, it shouldn't be said, really. It really shouldn't. Because it bothers me and others.
Well,
It would
that's what
bother
I
me
was.
too.
And I'm not
that-
on probation or parole.
That literally is what I was
follow
just saying.
rules and regulations, but I don't like hearing about this. It's just not good. I mean, if you read this paragraph, the second paragraph that you wrote, it sums it up. And I can sum it up even better, but I'm just saying, it should not be happening in 2019, and, we need to come to some type of policy where this is not happening. I mean, we're part of America, so if it's gonna be happening to us, I say let it happen to everyone.
Gwen, is there,
I
or
would-
Terry, are there ways that you could phrase this proposal about the inquiry that you would, back?
I mean, change the only thing I was focusing on is the last part after the comma. I mean, that's basically the proposal, right?
Unless there is an immediate threat to the safety of the officer or others?
Well, no, I would say, I could support this as a general notion if it is made clear that it's verbal, that it's a verbal inquiry, and that it puts the Oakland language in there as what I would call a good starting point, maybe, for, as we move through the process, maybe others will want to contribute to that language. I think at least it gives,
Do we need to?
it's not a, you can't, you have no options there. This gives them an option.
What do you mean?
If there's a threat.
The immediate threat to the safety of the officer or others?
Yeah,
Are you in favor of including that?
yeah.
All right. I frankly am not in favor of allowing for the check of records. First of all, I'm opposed to the searches. The reason for the check is in order to do the search. Second, the checking of records will happen, I believe, in a disparate way. It won't happen to me, and it won't happen to you, Terry. It will happen to the same people who are being asked. So I'm not sure what we achieve in terms of racial justice by saying you need to check the records and not ask the person. I can see that it is more respectful of the person not to ask them and to just check the records. But I suspect that the search data will be the same. if we allow searches based only on this condition of parole and probation, and we allow the officer to check records of people, the records of people of color will be checked as they are now, and I won't. So I don't think it's gonna solve the disparate problem.
Well, I couldn't support anything that would not allow them to check records on people, because it's like, hey, you need to know who you're dealing with. And this is just one piece of information.
How do we?
And how they handle it is something different. But
How do
it's
we
like-
constrain the bias? How do we limit the bias?
I mean, I presume when I get stopped for a traffic violation, when the guy goes back to his car, he runs my name and license number and finds out if anything's on me.
It checks records.
He
it
might
checks
not
your
ask me if
training
I'm on
orders,
parole or probation,
Checks
but
your driver's license.
They
it
check
checks-
the DMV records, but they don't necessarily check
No, it's
whether
all
you're
one
on.
check. It's all one check.
It's one check?
And when we put your name in the computer, it queries several systems through the state database. It queries.
That's
warrant-
not what I saw on body worn camera one time,
It queries.
where they have to ask the dispatcher, are they on parole or
Okay.
probation?
When I check something in my computer, okay, it tells me, it checks domestic violence restraining orders if you have any. It checks whether or not you have a warrant, whether or not you're active to probation or parole, whether or not you have search conditions, your driver's license. It conducts several checks through several systems, punching your name into my computer. And we do that as a matter of routine. So it's less routine that we would not do that.
So everybody gets checked?
No, I'm not gonna say that. Sometimes you go up to a stop and you're like, hey, did you know your lights were off, ma'am? Okay, can you turn them
No,
on?
but
It's
if you're
dark
gonna give me,
outside.
if you're gonna give me
Yeah,
a
but-
ticket, you've checked all of that stuff on me?
So it's more often than not, the high likelihood we're gonna be running out records to support just the process of finishing a ticket.
yeah. I got a ticket a couple of years ago. It wasn't in Berkeley, it was in Albany actually. And the guy came up, he checked my license, he went back to the car, and he was like, didn't take him that long to write a ticket. I presume he was writing my name and what was going on. And he came back and said, well, you've got a pretty good driving record and so forth, so keep it that way, or something like that. So I presumed he ran my ID numbers and tried to find out.
Say, Lieutenant, if you run the record on a person and find out they're on parole and probation, how is that useful to you?
What do you mean?
Now it's useful because you can search their vehicle.
Yeah, and
Is that the only reason you wanna know?
it's also background about who you're dealing with, right? If they're on probation for shooting at officers, that's certainly relevant information you'd want to know. If they're on probation for guns,
Or any kind of gun violence.
or it's relevant information that helps you conduct the rest of the stop.
Okay, Gwen, how do you feel about this proposal?
Which one are we talking about? The one that you're writing?
The inquiry, yeah.
Oh, the inquiry? I didn't have a problem with the inquiry. We discussed this at our last meeting when I brought up the fact that they can check through your identification or your driver's license all the different databases. I said that the last meeting.
Okay, how
He
about
just
we,
reaffirmed it. So
how about we
you don't
insert?
need to ask people. You
Yeah, this wouldn't
And
have
I
them
said
out.
that last time, so it's like I'm repeating myself over and over. I mean,
Okay, so
and
how,
he's just said it again, so.
how about we say our proposal is that the BPD officer shall not make such oral inquiries unless there's immediate threat to the safety of the officer or others? Would that be something you'd feel comfortable voting on?
No, I wouldn't.
Why?
Well, he just said when he makes a stop, he's already looked at your license. When you present him with your identification or your driver's license, he can run a check then. He doesn't have to ask you.
What part of that proposal don't you agree with?
Well, I don't think you should be asking people that. I just don't think.
That's what the proposal
You
is.
wouldn't
They
allow
shall
them to
not-
ask.
They shall not be making such oral inquiries unless there's an immediate threat. Is that
They're not
something you?
asking the question.
Excuse me?
They're not asking.
They're not asking the question in this case.
Unless there's an immediate threat. Who decides what a threat is?
Oh, you wanna take out unless there's an immediate threat?
Exactly, because if I'm just sitting in my car and you
Mhm.
come up to me and you ask me and I present to you what you asked me for, then you go and check it. I mean, I don't think I look threatening. unless it's based on my color, and
Mhm.
maybe that's what's making you feel threatened, I don't know.
Mhm.
But I'm just saying, I don't see why you need to do that. I think once you get the information in your hand, you can check all of,
Right.
all over the world on a
Right.
person. So that's all I'm saying. I
Well,
don't
I'd be
think that
willing to
needs
go,
be in.
I'd be willing to go either, vote on either construction.
So I think I pointed out last week too, that we're kind of imagining like the perfect stop where somebody gives you a driver's license and they have their registration, their insurance, and the license plates are the driver, and just like a really simple stop. But a lot of these stops really are investigations. The person doesn't give you a driver's license, they tell you their name, and then the insurance is at the house, and or that's not their vehicle, it's just not, and you couldn't learn anything about the driver by running the license plate. They could give you the registration and insurance, but the car belongs to an aunt and they borrowed it for the day, or they've been loaned the vehicle.
What are you saying? I don't understand what you're saying.
My point is that there are times when you're doing an investigation to find out who somebody is.
Yeah.
And some of those times are when somebody's lying about their identity, and actually asking questions, like, for example, somebody, and this happens quite a bit, people, more than people maybe imagine, because it's hard as an innocent, good citizen to put
This
yourself.
allows for you to check the records.
Yeah, but records of what? So Ms. Allamby is saying you could just get it from your driver's license, go back and run the computer, and not need to ask questions. But like, for example, one of the main questions that helps us identify somebody is, have you ever been arrested? Because if I can ask, if you say, yes, I've been arrested before, then I say, oh, okay, when?
Don't you need to know their name?
You might, so let's say that, but they might have lied about their name. So sometimes these.
Well, I don't understand what your logic here. If they lie about their name, they're gonna lie to you about whether they're on parole.
No, that's not, the point is that you could find yourself in a stop where you don't have all the information that is being imagined we actually
And
have
so what
on stops.
information do you get now from the person?
So when somebody says they've been, if let's say I ask somebody, have you ever been arrested before? And then they say, yeah, I've been arrested before. In Alameda County? Yeah, you've been arrested in Alameda County.
Why wouldn't they lie just as much as lie about their name?
You'd be surprised.
Okay,
You'd be
I
surprised.
don't
So-
understand
So
how it
does
has.
does that mean that
Yeah.
you, if they have been arrested, what do you do then?
So typically the next question I would ask is, have you been arrested in Alameda County? Okay, what's your personal file number? Okay, the personal file number, now they're telling me a second lie. So the issue, because if they continue to try and hide identity, the questions that I ask can elicit contradictions. Those contradictions tell me how I should be dealing with this person. So if they say they've been arrested, I should have a record of them. They say they have a driver's license, they don't give me a name that I can pull back with the driver's license. Now I'm doing an investigation about what the truth is here. And you know what happens when I ask those questions? The stop changes. I put that person in handcuffs because now I'm doing an investigation about lying to a police officer. What I'm saying is, there are investigations and situations that are not as straightforward as
I
just
don't
stopping somebody.
understand how not asking about probation and parole changes any of this.
Because sometimes you say, I'm on probation parole, and you're imagining that the logic would follow that they would also lie about that. But the truth is they sometimes will tell you the truth about one thing and lie about another.
Okay,
And
well,
so,
I think we have to move on and
I
vote
could
on this.
support the extended language, I couldn't
Okay.
support the,
Okay, so the extended language would read, our proposal is that the BPD officers shall not make such oral inquiries unless there is an immediate threat to the safety of the officer or others.
right, I could support that.
And Gwen, you're not willing to vote for that?
No.
And your alternative, motion would be to
I'll
leave
leave
out
that
that
out.
final thing, but leave in the thing about oral inquiry.
Mhm.
Well, what I propose is that we submit the motion and the substitute motion, both of them, to
Okay.
our commission.
Okay.
And say that some of us agreed on each of these two things. I'd be
Sounds
willing to
good.
go with either one.
Yeah.
And so I'd like to propose that to the commission.
Sounds good.
And in the meantime, I will do a little bit of research on a few of these other states and
And then I'll try to get
the exact wording of Oakland.
Right.
I'd be interested to know what the discussion was that led to the final product in Oakland, because I don't think it goes very far.
Yeah.
So we're gonna meet again on that, and then,
Well, we'll meet again, but we have to figure out when. You're leaving the end of the month, right?
yeah, end of the month.
Mhm.
I'll be around most of the time between
Today
now and then.
is the
11th.
11th,
Mhm.
and today is
Yeah.
Thursday. What about, a week from today is the 18th.
Week from today is
The
the
18th.
18th, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Would it be possible to meet the 18th at 11?
I could do that.
I can do that, and I'll try to have this information. I'll start looking for it today.
Would I be invited back?
If
course.
you're always welcome.
Yeah.
You're always
It's an
welcome.
open
And find
meeting.
out what happened to Muscle.
I will find that out. You probably
Is
got
that the
busted.
same
way over
time,
there.
same time?
11
11 a.m.
o'clock here Thursday, yeah.
You probably got arrested or way over there.
Or got questioned.
Questioned, yeah.
Is there public comment?
Okay.
Oh,
Are we ready
yes,
to adjourn?
I'm sorry, no, we
Oh,
need public comment.
Yeah, public comment.
Sorry.
Does anybody have public comment? Christine?
Yes. Christine Schwartz here. I do the videos and outreach, these important subjects matters because it affects everyone here and in the community. I like what you said about unless in danger. However, I'm a little confused about how the officers will know that they're in immediate danger and the time before that. So, I'm not a police officer, I'm not trained. If there's hesitation in what they're doing, it might put them in jeopardy. As it is now, as I said before, sometimes police officers on stops get killed without any questioning at all. That's my concern. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you all.
Okay.
We'll see
We're
you at,
adjourned?
Thank you, Kitty.
yeah.
Yeah.